We are on the book of Deuteronomy, and this is lesson number 2, part 2. And the title of this lesson is Honor God in the Present, covering chapters 12 through to 17. The objective of this lesson is the real God is living and active. Now that may sound like I always hear that, but that's an important statement. The real God is living and active. And the subject here is that all other gods are a fabrication. But we will look at that as we go through this lesson. Key text is Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verses 1, 2, and 3. These are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land. You can latch on to every word that's said on here so that we understand it properly. In the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess. And that's the land of milk and honey, the promised land. As long as you live in the land. So destroy completely all the places on the high mountains and on the hills and under every spreading tree, where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire, cut down the idols of their gods, and wipe out their names from those places. That's the key text. So Israel is on the brink of entering the promised land, and Moses speaks to them in 3 sermons before he dies. So you be familiar with the map. They are on the plains of Moab, just about to cross the Jordan and enter into the promised land. Moses is about to die. He gives these 3 sermons. His first sermon was for Israel to remember all that God did for them in the past. His second sermon is for them to honor God in the present, in real time. And his third sermon is for them to trust God for the future. Maybe we can look at this another way. Faith, hope, and love. We know those 3 words. But let's look at Moses' 3 sermons that way. So faith is based on what God has done in the past. That's what faith is. Love is to honor God in the present, in the now, in real time. Hope is to trust God for the future. You don't hope for what's in the past, right? You hope for what's in the future. So that's what faith, hope, and love is about. If we could use that to analyze Moses' 3 sermons. In this lesson, we will look at part 2 of Honor God in the Present. So in the first part of the sermon, Moses taught the people that there is only one God and Creator who is living and active. This God, being the only God in existence, is constantly being made known through these scriptures. There's only one God. There isn't another like Him in existence. So to love Him as God must be an exclusive kind of love. Don't love any other gods. There's only one God in existence. Love Him only. It has to be an undivided love. So in the second part of his sermon, Moses proves to the Israelites that other gods are a fabrication. They cannot love, they cannot speak, they cannot give commandments, because they are not real gods. Therefore, they are called idols. You wonder why they're called idols? I don't know, but I think they cannot do anything. So idolaters make their own rules for worship, because their idols cannot give any rules for worship. So the worshippers make their own rules, as if it's coming from their gods. So how is Israel to love God exclusively? They are to constantly focus on his commands. And you know, idols cannot give commands. So Israel was to constantly focus on God's commands. Destroy idolatry. Know that their relationship with the true God is real and active. And always remember that the real God gave them their freedom. And these are the crucial lessons for Israel before entering the promised land. This was the younger generation Israelites. So let's take a look at chapter 12, honor God and destroy idolatry. This chapter is about worshiping God in his way and no other way. So can the real God be destroyed? No. Can idols be destroyed? Yes. What does that prove? Idols are not real gods, because the real God cannot be destroyed. So destroying idols means that they are not true gods. There can only be one God, and all other gods are disqualified. Only one God is responsible for all of creation. Otherwise, creation would be a disaster. Imagine if you had multiple gods, and one God created the sea, another created the land, and another created the planets. It will be a total disaster. One God created everything, and he upholds everything perfectly. Everything in his creation works in harmony with each other. Think about the ecosystem, ecology. People that know how the ecosystem works would have to understand that God exists, and there has to be only one, not multiple. Multiple gods and who created different things would be a total disaster. Some religions teach that all gods are the same, as they use the illustration, all rivers lead to the sea. So some of these religions accept Jesus Christ as one of their many gods. It is their belief that all gods are the same, which makes them accept Jesus Christ as just another God. But this belief contradicts the Bible. The Bible teaches that there is only one true God in existence who created all things. Therefore, worship to him is restricted to him only. And God requires the Israelites to worship him in a particular way. Let's take a look at two verses here. Chapter 12, verse 4, and we'll look at verse 31. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way. And verse 31, you must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. That's what the Canaanites were doing. Archaeology has proven or found babies within the walls of Canaanites. So idols cannot tell how they want to be worshipped, but the real God specifies exactly how Israel should worship him. They couldn't see this God, but he brought them through the Red Sea, delivered them from Egypt, fed them in the wilderness. Was he real? Absolutely. And the real God ordered false gods to be destroyed. Does he have a right to do that? Absolutely, he's the real God. Destroy all idols. So God ordered that idol worship places, temples, shrines, and altars must be destroyed completely. When this young generation of Israelites go into the land of Canaan, they were to do a complete destruction. Look at verses 2 and 3. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains and on the hills and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire, cut down the idols of their gods, and wipe out their names from these places. Is God being unfair to Canaanites? You know that God gave the Canaanites 1,000 years grace to turn to Him, and they didn't. But you can go back to the book of Genesis. We do talk about that a little bit there. And the place for Israel to worship was to be God's choice, not Israel's choice. Take a look at verse 11. Then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for His name, there you are to bring everything I command you. This is a living, active God. Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, and all the choice possessions you have vowed to the Lord. So the worship involves everyone in that nation. Verse 12. And there rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your men servants and maid servants. Everyone is to worship. And the Levites from your towns who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. So sons and daughters are to worship as opposed to idol worshippers who sacrifice their children. They didn't get their children to worship, they just sacrificed them to their gods. Verse 31. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. So true worship involved masters and servants, rich and poor, leaders and followers, parents and children, native born and foreigners. God gave them freedom to eat meat anywhere on the land except the meat offered for worship, which they are to eat at the specified place. So we'll look at a few verses, 15, 17, and 18 of chapter 12. Nevertheless, you may slaughter your animals in any place of your towns and eat as much of the meat as you want, as if it were a gazelle or a deer, according to the blessing the Lord your God gives you. Both the ceremonially unclean and clean may eat it. Verse 17 and 18. You must not eat in your own towns the tithe of your grain and new wine and oil, or the firstborn of your herds and flocks, or whatever you have vowed to give, or your freewill offerings or special gifts. Instead, you are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God will choose. You, your sons and your daughters, your men servants and maid servants, and the Levites from your towns, you are to rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you put your hand to. So further, they were commanded not to study idolatry. Don't study idolatry, because it will create a temptation to worship idols. It's dangerous. Verse 30. And after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by what? Inquiring about their gods. Don't study those gods. Be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. So the study of witchcraft, demonology, Satanism, even the study of other religions was forbidden by the God of Israel. God wants idolatry to be rejected and not studied. Be careful. You will be ensnared. Don't study demonology. And Israel was not allowed to alter God's instructions. Verse 32, see that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. It's God's commandments. So Israel is to honor God by obeying His commands and destroying idolatry. Let's look at chapter 13. False prophets are idolaters. Surprise, surprise. False prophets are idolaters. External idolatry is dealt with in chapter 12. Destroy all the idols. Internal idolatry is dealt with in chapter 13. And that's what we're going to talk about. Now that Israel knows who the one true God is, they must be able to spot a false prophet who misleads the nation into idolatry. You've got to be able to spot them. They can be subtle, though. They are not to be blinded by miracles done by false prophets with false messages. Do false prophets do miracles? Yes, they do. Read Deuteronomy chapter 13. God Himself is saying, false prophets. So let's look at the first 3 verses. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a miraculous sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder of which he has spoken takes place, the miracle happens, and he says, let us follow other gods, gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is what? Testing you to find out whether you love Him with all your heart and with all your soul. Don't look at a false prophet doing a miracle and then believe all these words. You've got to test those words. So prophets must be tested with truth and not their ability to do miracles. Be careful, Israelites, but even in today's world, we ought to be careful about that. Take a look at verse 5. The prophet or dreamer must be put to death because he preached rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. He has tried to turn you from the way the Lord your God commanded you to follow. You must purge the evil from among you. False prophets must be put to death even if they are a miracle worker. The words of God are more important than miracles. Now here's a lesson for us to learn, and it's right through the scriptures. The words of God are more important than miracles. False prophets will do anything to attract people into idolatry. But what are the idol worships of today? They attract people to the god of money, the god of popularity, the god of power, the god of status, the god of selfish ambition, and I can go on, etc., etc. Now, if a false prophet is a member of the family or a close friend, should he be overlooked? Could be a son or daughter, could be your parents, could be your uncle or auntie. Should they be overlooked? Let's take a look at chapter 13 and verse 6 and verse 10. If your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your fathers have known. And verse 10, stone him to death, because he tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. It's a serious lessons for the Israelites that Moses is giving them before he dies. For many, this is where the rubber meets the road in biblical theology. Some people consider family and friends to be more important than a commitment to God. Oh, my family comes first before God? Many people do that, though. How committed to God would the Israelites be, and where would they draw the line? Where would they say to God, this is where you stop? and I'm drawing the line. Does man set limits for God? Now, this chapter also tells us that a whole group of people can also be false. Now, don't think about this in modern times now, in the church age. This is for Israel. A whole group of people can be false. So if a false prophet is to be rejected, then the false organization must also be rejected. Idolatry among the Israelites is not acceptable. The whole group of people must be put to death. If it's a whole town, you kill everyone in that town. So you get a false prophet, you get false followers. You kill the false prophet, you kill all his followers, every one of them. And that's the command to the Israelites when they go into the land of Canaan. Chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. Then you must inquire, probe, and investigate it thoroughly. And if it is true that it has been proven that this detestable thing has been done among you, you must certainly put to the sword all who live in that town. Destroy it completely, both its people and its livestock. So the Israelites were required to know the true God and guard against false prophets. So it wasn't just idols that they were dealing with, they were also dealing with false prophets. They are to honor God by rejecting false prophets who promote idolatry. The ministry of a false prophet is idolatry, and it's not any different in our day and time. How we go about it may be different, though. We are not allowed to go and kill them. But be aware. Chapter 14. The true God set Israel apart as holy. So in chapters 14 and 15, God required the Israelites to live differently to the nations of the world. What does that mean? God wanted Israel to live differently to the nations of the world. Their lifestyle must be different. They were not to practice the traditions and customs of other nations in burying their dead. So don't follow the world's customs and traditions when you have your funerals. What were those nations doing, and what was Israel required not to do like them? Verses 1 and 2. You are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves and shave the front of your heads for the dead. Those are customs and traditions of the world. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God, out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. God is saying to them, I want you to be different. God wanted them to be separated from the rest of the world. Holy means separated or one of a kind. They were to worship differently, eat differently, and live differently, which identified them as being different. And that's how God separated them from the rest of the world. Do everything differently. So being different, however, does not mean that all the nations of the world were evil. Let's get our biblical understanding right here. Being different from the rest of the world doesn't mean that Israel or the other nations of the world were all evil. They were not. Or that everything that other nations did was evil. It's not the case. So what was it different about Israel that God wanted them to be different from the other nations? So animals were divided into clean and unclean for the purpose of identifying Israel as being different from the rest of the world. And you could refer to the notes on Leviticus lesson number 3. We do talk about that in that lesson. Unclean was not unclean in itself. You with me? Chapter 14, verse 7 and verse 10. However, of those who chew the cud and that have a split hoof completely divided, you may not eat the camel, the rabbit, or the coney. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a split hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for who? For you, for the Israelites. Specifically, right? Verse 10. But anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat. For you it is unclean. Does it mean it is unclean for everyone? No, God just wanted them to be different from the rest of the world. So He gave them commands that would show that they are different, the way they lived their lives, and what they ate was different to the rest of the world. And that's how God identified them as different. Unclean was unclean for Israel only. And that was God's way of separating them from the nations of the world. He wasn't saying, no, Israel, you are holy and the rest of the world is evil. That's not the case. No scripture says anything like that. Let's take a look at Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my commands, then out of all the nations, see that? Out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine. I separated you from the rest of the nations by making you do different things in different ways. That's all it is. So detestable. Some people may read this verse, chapter 14, verse 3. Do not eat any detestable thing. What is detestable? If detestable or unclean food was evil, we may interpret detestable as evil, but is it? How would we interpret the Bible? If detestable or unclean food was evil, then God would not have advised other nationalities to eat them either. Right? If a food was detestable, would God have other nations to eat it? No, He wouldn't. But let's take a look at verse 21. Do not eat anything that you find already dead. You may give it to an alien living in your towns, and he may eat it. So it is detestable evil? Why would God have an alien or a foreigner eat it? Give it to him, he can eat it. But you don't. God's just differentiating them with other nations. That's what showed that they were different. Or you may sell it to a foreigner, but you are a people only to the Lord your God. You don't eat it. I'm not giving that command to other nations, is what God is saying. I'm giving that command to you. Ammonites, Moabites, and Egyptians ate certain types of animals that Israel was restricted from eating. The purpose was to separate them from the nations of the world. Let's not complicate biblical theology. All it was, God was separating them from the nations of the world. He wasn't saying that everyone was evil and only Israel was holy. Actually, Israel was worse than all the nations of the world, and as we go through these books, we will see that. It was not to declare foods as evil. No. That was God's way of separating Israel from the nations of the world. Let's look at tithes, the topic of tithes. Quite a controversial subject, right? But let's look at it. Setting aside the tithes reminded the Israelites that God supplied their crops and cattle. So when they set aside the tenth, the tithes, that's what they acknowledge, that God supplied all my crops and my cattle. So unlike the Canaanites would thank their idols for the good land, Israel's tithes were an acknowledgement that the living God provided the good land. That's what the tithes were speaking about. Remember, there were 3 specific tithes that the Israelites were required to pay. There were 3 different tithes. So let's take a look at the first tithe. This was exclusively for the Levites. So when this tithe was paid by the Israelites, all their tithes went to the Levites. Look at chapter 18, verses 21 to 24. I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work that they do serving at the tent of meeting. This is the tabernacle. Of course, it eventually became a temple, but the work that they did at the tent of meeting. From now on, the Israelites must not go near the tent of meeting. They will bear the consequences of their sin and will die. God is saying to the other tribes of Israel, y'all don't go near the tent of meeting, so you'll never collect any tithes. Only the Levites who do the work at the tent of meeting, the tithes will be paid to them. It is the Levites who are to do the work at the tent of meeting and bear the responsibility for offenses against it. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. They will receive no inheritance among the Israelites. So all the tribes of Israel got land inheritance, but the Levites did not get any land inheritance. Their inheritance is what? The tithes. So it was their wages for the work done at the tent of meeting. So let's look at verse 24. Instead, I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithes. That's what their inheritance was, that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. That is why I said concerning them, they will have no inheritance among the Israelites. Only Levites collected the tithes. Judah couldn't collect any tithes. Benjamites couldn't collect any tithes. Reubenites couldn't collect any tithes. It was only Levites. But let's take a look at the second tithe. And this tithe was to be eaten by the families of and the Levites. There's something different here. Let's take a look at verse 23 and verse 26 and 27. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. So they were to eat the tithes. This was the people and the Levites at the place the Lord will choose. Verse 26. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything that you wish. Then you or your household shall eat. Okay, I'm not telling you the story. I trust that you've read the chapters, so I'm explaining this. But what's happening here is that those who live far away, that couldn't bring their tithes because it was too much to carry, God is saying to them, okay, sell your tithes, bring the money, come to the place that God will choose, and then use that money to buy whatever. That's what verse 26 and 27 is talking about. Use the silver and buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites. So these families that brought the tithes were to eat it and share it with the Levites living in their towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. And that's the second tithe. The first tithe was for the Levites. The second tithe was used for fellowship. So think about it call it the fellowship tithe if you like. That's what it was. The first tithe was not a fellowship tithe. You bring it and it goes to the Levites. That's their inheritance. So let's look at the third tithe. And this one is for the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows. It was like a welfare system in the country of Israel. It's the third tithe. Verses 28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns. so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the aliens, the fatherless, the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So the third tithe was to take care of the poor, which was brought once in 3 years. Some scholars or even early church fathers call this the poor tithe. So you got the tithes for the Levites, the Levitical tithe, the fellowship tithe, and now the poor tithe within their towns. So this tithe, the tithe payer did not eat this tithe. It's not like the second one. There are some who think that there are just 2 tithes that's mentioned rather than 3, like I just mentioned. But if you know the Jewish historian Josephus that lived in the time of Christ, Josephus maintains that there are 3 tithes as I've shown in this lesson. But that's something that you could do some research, and because there are some that think that there are just 2. So the Israelites were to honor God with their tithes in acknowledgement that God provided all their crops and livestock. So they were not to give tithes to God so that God could give them more. No, they were to give tithes because God had already given them. That's an acknowledgement that God has already given me. Tithes is not a bargaining situation. Let's take a look at chapter 15. Honor God in the sabbatical year. The true God leads the nation of Israel as opposed to idols who cannot lead at all. So God rules by requiring that all debts to be cancelled in the 7th year, which is the sabbatical year. Cancel all debts. God does not want the leaders to enslave the borrowers because he freed them from slavery and supplied all their needs. What did God do with the Israelites from Egypt? Free them from slavery. Should there be slavery in Israel? God says, no, I took you out of slavery. Why would you want to get back into or enslave other people? God does not want the leaders to enslave the borrowers because he freed them from slavery and he supplied all their needs. So debt-free lifestyle is part of being in a milk and honey land. Can you imagine if Israelites living on a milk and honey land and they are riddled with debts? I owe this and I owe that and I owe everything else. And it's a milk and honey land. Doesn't make sense, right? No debts are to be there in that country. So let's take a look at chapter 15, verses 2 and 4. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel the loan he has made to his fellow Israelite. He shall not require payment from his fellow Israelite or brother, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. That's the year of the sabbatical year. It's every 7th year. Verse 4, however, there should be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. So there should be no poor. If they were poor, what would they call the land of milk and honey? Milk and honey? God does not want the poor to be enslaved. Other nations enslaved the poor and abused them because but God required Israel to be different. You don't make slaves. So they were required to free slaves in the 7th year. Israel was delivered from slavery, and therefore they are not to enslave each other. They were slaves, but don't you become slave masters. As God freed them, so they are to cancel debts, free slaves, and enjoy fellowship with each other. That's on the land of milk and honey. The firstborn of all their flocks and herds was God's way of getting the Israelites to celebrate freedom. All the firstborn animals use that for fellowship. Verses 19 and 20. Set apart for the Lord your God every firstborn male of your herds and flocks. Do not put the firstborn of your oxen to work, and do not shear the firstborn of your sheep. Each year you and your family are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place that he will choose. So eating the firstborn animal signified fellowship with God and with one another. It's amazing that every time we talk about fellowship here, even in these Old Testament books, Old Covenant, it had to do with eating. They were to eat in the presence of the Lord. So they were in fellowship with God and with one another, so they shared their food with each other. Although they cannot see God, their fellowship was to be in his presence. Verse 20. Each year you and your family are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place that he will choose. So that fellowship was to be in his presence. They were in fellowship with God. We talked about the table of showbread when we talked about the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. You can go back and refer to the notes on that. But it was fellowship with God. It had to do with eating. So although God cannot be seen, yet he delivered them from slavery. That's amazing. Gave them the land of rest and leads them in freedom. This would be a bad one for atheists, though. If you believe that God doesn't exist, then who opened the sea for the Israelites to walk through? Therefore, the Israelites are to honor God by obeying his commands. Chapter 16, honor God with your festivals. So God chooses the place of worship and does not leave that up to the people. And then so from freeing them from Egypt right down to choosing the place of worship was all done by God. Took them out of Egypt, and he chooses the place that they should worship. Idol worshippers have many places of worship, but Israel is required to have only one place. And God required all the men in Israel to assemble for 3 annual festivals: the Passover festival, the Feast of Weeks, which is harvest, and the Feast of Tabernacles. These were annual festivals. And all the men in Israel were to gather for these 3 festivals. But the gathering must be at the place the Lord will choose. These festivals were a celebration of joy and freedom in the Lord. Joy and freedom in the Lord. But think about that. Nothing was to be sad. Let's look at verse 11, verse 13, and verse 14. So verse 11 says, rejoice before the Lord your God. Verse 13, celebrate the feasts. Verse 14, be joyful at your feasts. There is nothing to be sad about in this place. Slaves don't celebrate, but free people do. And each man was to bring his gift in proportion to how the Lord blessed him. If you are in fellowship, bring along. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 17, each of you must bring his gift in proportion. So if you have a lot, you will bring more. If you have a little, you'll bring in proportion to what you have. No one's requiring a poor person to bring as much as a rich person could bring. Everything was in proportion. In proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. So God has given some more and he's given others less. But no one was exempt from bringing. The poor were not exempt from bringing. They were to bring in proportion. These gifts were not to get more from the Lord. It wasn't a bargaining situation, but to show that God had already supplied their needs. Nobody is required to give to the God of the Bible to try to get more from him. not at any time. People always give to God because God has already given to them first. Giving to God is an acknowledgement that God has given to them. As free men, God requires them to treat each other with justice and righteousness. Verse 19, do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe. Does that word sound familiar to us? Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. It is quite amazing that there used to be bribery and corruption in the justice system back in those days. The world changed? No. We have a lot of corruption and bribery in our day and time. Therefore, Israel was warned not to allow the practice of discrimination and bribery with each other. You are in the land of milk and honey. No briberies, no corruption. Carry out justice. God did not give them the land of milk and honey for them to engage in corruption and bribery. So Israel was to honor God for the festivals of celebration. Let's take a look at chapter 17. Stay true to the Lord. Israel was reminded not to recreate destroyed idols. You destroy the idols, don't recreate them. Chapter 16, verses 21 and 22. Do not set up any wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to the Lord your God. Do not erect a sacred stone, for these the Lord your God hates. Anyone found guilty of idol worship must be investigated and given the death penalty on the basis of 2 or more witnesses. In the country of Israel, under the Old Covenant, there was no freedom of religion. Not under the Old Covenant in the country of Israel with the Mosaic Law. There was no freedom of religion. This is not the same in the church age, as the new covenant is based on a different premise. And we will talk about that. However, in the country of Israel, idol worshippers were executed by stoning. The witnesses were required to cast the first stones. They were to start the stoning. And this would be a serious caution or warning not to be false witnesses. Because you are the one, if you're a witness, you have to cast the first stones. However, the matter of idolatry must be thoroughly investigated as required. Verse 3 and 4. And contrary to my command, as worshipped other gods, bowing down to them, or to the sun, or to the moon, or the stars of the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true that it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, so there has to be a careful investigation done. No one is to be put to death on the basis of one witness. There must be 2 or more witnesses. The law court's justice system must make a righteous judgment, because the person is going to die. Make a righteous judgment. Idolatry in Israel is not only a rejection of God, but it is also a capital offense. Remember, it's a country. The Mosaic Law was the government's laws for the whole country. So idolatry was not just a rejection of God, it was also a capital offense. Remember, all Israel's laws are national laws, and national laws are the country's laws. And when the priestly judge gives the verdict, it has to be nationally accepted. No one was allowed to disrespect the Levitical priestly judge. Who were the judges here in Israel? The priesthood. The religious leaders were the judges. But no one was allowed to disrespect the priestly Levitical judge. Disrespecting the judge will result in the death penalty. You disrespect the judge, you will die for it. And God, knowing the future of Israel based on their past behavior, He saw that they will ask for a king to rule over them. Don't use this scripture to say God knew their future and that they will ask for a king because He just knows everything in the future. That may be true, but this is not what this scripture is talking about. God, knowing the future of Israel based on their past behavior, He saw that they will ask for a king to rule over them. They will ask for a king like the nations around them. And this was not something that God wanted for them. Did God want a human king to rule over them? No, He did not. Having a human king will destroy part of their identity as being different. Remember, God is separating Israel from the nations of the world. The nations of the world have kings. And God said to Israel, you won't have a human king. But now if you want a human king, you're going to destroy some of your identity as being different. Remember, God separated them from the nations and He wanted them to be different. However, while God will allow the request that He gives, their request for a king, He does give them some rules and restrictions for their king. So if you want a king, here are some rules and restrictions. This is God being patient with rebellious Israel. In His patience, God commands the human king to be God-fearing. If you want a king, make sure he is God-fearing. And the commands for the future king are that the Lord must choose the man. Verse 15. He must not be power-hungry. Verse 16. These are good rules for anyone who wants to be leaders of a country, political leaders. He must not use people to get rich. Verse 16. He must be a faithful husband. Verse 17. He must not be greedy for wealth. Verse 17. That's personal gain. He must read, understand, and obey the word of the Lord all the days of his life. Verse 19. And then verse 20. He must not elevate himself above the people. You are not more important or bigger than the people. So, in conclusion, what can we say? Honor God in the present means that He is ever present. Fabricated gods will fade away. And so we see that the world does not have Canaanite gods in existence anymore. You go and read about the Canaanite gods. Are they in the world today? No, they faded away. They ceased to exist. The question is, should the Canaanites be angry that God ordered all their gods to be destroyed, their altars, the sacred stones, Asherah poles, etc., to be destroyed? God was not being unfair. Should any nation be angry for their gods to be destroyed? That's a fair question. And a reasonable answer will be no. If a god can be destroyed, it is not really a god. And the real God was showing them that any God that can be destroyed is not a real God. If you go back to the book of Genesis, remember Jacob's 2 wives? And when they left Padan Aram and were going back to the land of Canaan, he had 2 wives, right? Leah and Rachel. Rachel stole her father's gods and hid them while they traveled. If a god can be stolen, it's not a god. And if a god can be destroyed, it's not a god. The real problem, however, is not really the idol, but the people who reject the real God. Here's the real problem. It's people who reject the true God in their hearts. Idols are not going to stand in judgment. They're just dead idols. They're not going to stand in judgment, but the people are. And so the one true God is being gracious to them by showing them that He alone is God. There's always an opportunity to turn to the one true God. Idols can be destroyed, but the one true God lives forever. And many Canaanites saw this and they believed. Oh yeah, God said to Israel, destroy all the Canaanites. But what happens if a Canaanite believed in the true God? Rahab was a Canaanite. She believed in the true God. She even became part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and she was a Canaanite. And we'll see later on how Uriah the Canaanite believed in the one true God. We'll also see that how a whole group of Canaanites, a whole town, won a case against an Israelite royal family. They won a case against an Israelite royal family. And these Canaanites were given the right to execute members of the Israelite royal family. Canaanites, a whole group of them, were going to execute members of a royal family in Israel. What did God do about that? And these Canaanites, they did the execution before who? Jehovah. Jehovah. And God said nothing, as he was fair to all nationalities. We'll talk about that I'm just jumping ahead a little bit. There was no favorite on God's part. And so we see that there were many Canaanites who knew the true God. The problem was people turning against the true God, whether you were Israelite or Canaanite or Moabite or Egyptian or whatever nationality. Don't turn against the true God. If you turn to him, there's no favorites. There is only one true God for Israel and for Canaanites and for Moabites and for Egyptians, etc., etc. So for every nation on earth, there is only one true God. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Father, we are truly grateful that as we go through these books, as we go through these chapters, we are learning more about your relationship with the Israelites during the Old Covenant times. And we are seeing that you are righteous, you are not a God of favoritism. You didn't favor Israel over people that turned to you from other nationalities. But you showed justice and you didn't promote slavery. But we are truly grateful, Lord, as we continue to read these chapters, to see what you are like and to grow in our knowledge of what you are like, and therefore worship you in a greater way. Thankful in Jesus' name. Amen.